How's it going everyone, Rival right here and welcome back to the channel. So Pokemon game anniversaries are a dime a dozen at the moment, and it's become quite a common occurrence to discuss Pokemon anniversaries on my channel. I promise this isn't intentional or anything, it just so happens that this year Pokemon has a lot of games that are hitting either a 5 or a 0 milestone in the same year. It does help that at one point the remakes for Pokemon were released every 5 years, with the break from this tradition being Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, which, considering the fan reception and reviews for those two remakes, that's entirely on brand for them. Of course, it's not just limited to the main series. You will have to stay tuned for the inevitable video on one of the best Pokemon games ever made. Pokemon Dash, of course. There hasn't been a game like it since. But few have probably made as big of an impact on the series as Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green. It'd be very hard for some people to remember a time without any Pokemon remakes, because nowadays, not just for Pokemon but gaming in general, has now moved towards a big market for remakes, remasters, reboots, ports and ultra mega collections. And there's some games that have a lot of them. I remember Final Fantasy X having at least 4 separate remakes just for itself. And did I buy all of them? Yes, I did. Is this partly because gaming just isn't on the same level that it was 20 years ago? Or is it an attempt from companies to make a big cash grab because they know fans all around the world simply want to relive their childhoods? Who knows, but in 2004 it certainly wasn't as common practice as it is now. But the game changed for Pokemon in 2004 with the release of Fire Red and Leaf Green. The first remakes for the main series Pokemon games created a new genre and idea that's become one of the main desirable selling points of the franchise, by taking a previous region and improving on what was already there, but also incorporating elements that the region needed. We got games that certainly gave the original region their deserved remodeling, alongside the second remake's Heart Gold and Soul Silver, which is also celebrating an anniversary that's 5 or 0 this year. We had games that essentially set the precedent and benchmark for any future remake. It was not only well received by fans but by reviews as well, improving on nearly every single element within the game. Well, almost everything. I'm not going to say that it's a flawless game, of course, because no game is. Well, you might be able to argue that a Zelda game comes close, but there's no doubting they set us on the course we're on now for the franchise. So 20 years on, let's revisit Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green. What was so good about them and what was not good about them? Now, the idea to remake a beloved game from years ago does seem like a no-brainer in today's video game market. Pokemon Red and Green were great games and the most successful ones ever made in terms of units sold, but they also came out in 1996 in Japan. By 2004, the technological developments in not just games, but Pokemon in general showed a massive gap in capabilities. When you consider we just had the 3rd generation games released not too long before, with Pokemon Fire Red taking advantage of the developments on the Game Boy Advance, the gulf was pretty obvious. Plus, let's be honest, it's a very good business strategy to adopt. While they're not the first to see the potential in the remake/remaster model, because it is something that has existed even back in the 80s and 90s, Pokemon jumped on the market at the right time before it became a massive and fast growing market. I'm sure most could point to a particular collection outside of Pokemon that is a remake or a remaster of a previous game and say it's one of their favourites. For example, I remember when the Budokai collection came out on the PS3 and Xbox. I bought that thing almost instantly. Being one of the first companies to see how the market was growing is a pretty impressive feat, but Nintendo and their subsidiaries have always been like that. That's why they've always been at the top of the video game bracket since the NES days, and they arguably still are despite more powerful consoles competing against it. They not only set themselves up with a great marketing strategy, but also fixed major issues in arguably their biggest franchise. Let's just say it how it is, the original games were notoriously buggy and messy games. In fact, they were that messy they'd actually had a re-release before they hit the Western market. The original games were Red and Green, but Blue was released 8 months later in Japan as a mail order exclusive version, and it included some updates including artwork and dialogue. Pokemon Blue would then become the basis source code for the international release, hence we got Red and Blue instead of Red and Green. Now, Blue fixed and updated a few things, but many bugs still existed, and the game still is an incredibly broken mess with the right sort of play. Granted, I think that works in the favour of the original games nowadays. The nostalgia for what the games represented at the time, the fun game-breaking glitches, and the cool ways that you could break the game. We even have speedruns like 151 Pokemon that intentionally break the game to an incredible degree in order to obtain every Pokemon, even if it's not possible within that particular game. Plus, the originals are now approaching 30 years old and were made by a small team, so there's more of an excuse on top of the nostalgia element for issues in that game compared to something like Scarlet and Violet. Plus, they were the games that that started it all and have set the precedent for the success that the franchise now has. So they also deserve a game that represents its impact. Plus, why wouldn't you want to play the original games but better? As Ruby and Sapphire had just been made, this made the process even easier to make a remake, as the game engine already existed on the Game Boy Advance to work off. All they had to do was modify the engine to make what they need and rebuild Kanto up again. It's also crazy to think, as Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green were in production, so was Pokemon Emerald, which, you guessed it, is also 20 years old this year from its original release. Pretty impressive in my opinion to be making both of them at the same time for a 2004 release. Now granted, they already knew Kanto, so they didn't need to think of an entire story, and they had just made Ruby and Sapphire, so Emerald was just modifying those games. But even so, two of the best games in 1 year. I would go on record to say 2004 is probably one of the best years Pokemon's ever had. Some of the TCG sets were great this year. The anime was in the midst of both Advanced Challenge and Advanced Battle. I think it's hard to argue in my opinion. Maybe a discussion for another time, but yeah, they were killing it in 2004. When the time came to release the games in the West, the original Japanese release names were kept with red and green, without modifying it to red and blue. I suppose if it had, we'd end up having a game called Pokemon Water Blue, which sounds odd, but we are used to the old titles, so of course it sounds weird. According to the internet, so take it with a pinch of salt, this was a choice on the development director's behalf, as Leaf represented a peace icon instead of the conflicting fire and water styles. Another point to make is that the internet was becoming much more accessible, and with Pokemon having a lot of hype around it, people would find out about the name and brand change, so it's better just to keep it the same. Weirdly enough, the game actually had a limited release in Japan. While there's no exact confirmation as to why a remake of Generation 1 had such a small amount of copies made available for it, so I am just spitballing here, but they might have thought there won't be as big of a demand for it. I know that Generation 3 is very well loved nowadays, but back in the day, in terms of sales, it was actually quite far down compared to the first two generations. Another potential reason could be the wireless adapter bundle, because they were originally included in the release as well. Also, for clarification for everybody, it's important to note the difference between a remake and a remaster. Whilst a remaster is incredibly faithful to the originals, changing usually just the graphical capabilities, remakes change the outdated gameplay, hence it's a remake, not a remaster. As Pokemon had now moved on to Generation 3 from its original Generation 1 roots, there are a lot of general life changes that have been made to the gameplay to improve on issues from the original generation. Some of these I have brought up previously when discussing Gold and Silver, so I will briefly mention some of them, but there was also changes in Generation 3 added as well. The first major change was definitely the special split. Back in Generation 1, there were some interesting design choices. We end up having a separate stat for both attack and defense, but for some strange reason we ended up only having one stat for special. This was an incredibly broken element of the original, because some Pokemon would have a very high special stat, which would mean they could wall a lot of attacks but also hit hard. Well, in Generation 2 this was split and therefore included in the remakes, and this can definitely change a team plan. Just to highlight two Pokemon in particular that were hit very hard by this in an attacking sense, Chansey and Tauros lost a significant number in special attack by this split. Very unfortunate, especially for Tauros, because it's a very feasible mixed attacker in the original with a great move pool, but in Generation 3 that attack leaves a lot to be desired. Chansey would eventually get a renaissance, especially when that Eviolite exists, but in terms of a general playthrough this really hurt them. Alakazam actually had the opposite issue, as it ended up losing a good amount of special defense. In fact, Alakazam and Psychic Pokemon in general were arguably the most affected by the time Generation 3 had come round. They were comfortably the strongest type in Red and Blue, owing to programming error and making ghost attacks have zero effect on psychic Pokemon, bug types not having any strong moves at all, and most of them being incredibly fast, and the crit ratio was worked out based on speed. By Generation 3, however, not only was that crit ratio changed, but a new type had been introduced in the Dark type to completely nullify psychic types. The issue with ghost attacks not hitting them was fixed to being super effective, and there were some stronger bug moves in the game as well. No dark type Pokemon existed in Generation 1 of course, and no Pokemon in the original Dex was right to change its type, so unfortunately Fire Red and Leaf Green does not have them available until the post game, but that wasn't the same for their other new typing. Steel types have now become the premier defense typing in Pokemon after they were introduced in Generation 2, and one line had actually had its type changed to fit in with this. Magnemite and Magneton were now Steel and Electric. Electric, meaning you could obtain this type if you wanted to use it during a general playthrough of Fire Red and Leaf Green. It wasn't just the positives in Generation 2 that made Fire Red and Leaf Green better. Generation 3 brought in a few major changes that positively influenced the Pokemon in Fire Red and Leaf Green. Abilities had now been introduced, meaning the original 151 all now had an ability that they could benefit from in battle. Pokemon like Gyarados and Arcanine gained Intimidate to immediately lower the attack of the opposing Pokemon, making some Pokemon even better than they were previously. A Pokemon like Aerodactyl benefited from getting two different abilities, with either of them being great options. One that increased the amount of PP the opposing Pokemon used, and another that got rid of recall damage, allowing moves like Double Edge to no longer carry a disadvantage. The abilities provided extra layers to Pokemon you might not have used previously in the past, and could easily make a Pokemon you haven't considered previously as a viable option as a team member. Weezing, for example, obtained Levitate, which literally removed one of its weaknesses from harming it. Abilities are now so common and so many of them exist. In fact, some Pokemon in this region benefited from more abilities added in later games, such as Cloyster, which was skill linked meant it could always hit 5 times from a 2 to 5 times move. But back then it was a pretty big change. Ruby and Sapphire had been out at this point and abilities were becoming very important, but this was the first time we got to see the benefits of some of these Pokemon in a general run through. Another big change was the addition of Natures. One particular stat would benefit at the expense of another, or it would have a neutral effect on all stats. This would play a big part, especially considering the physical special types, but it did not exist until Generation 4. Pokemon always operated on the idea that certain types were physical and some were special. The best way to remember it is, if it has an evolution including the future ones minus Sylveon, or its dragon, it's special, the rest are physical. So for example, Fire type is special, even if you use Fire Punch, which you know is punching, and you would get the physical attributes including static, it would still use your special type attack. So you really have to plan your moves to the most optimum style. If you used Aerodactyl and it had Double Edge, Earthquake, Rock Slide and Steel Wing, well, normal, ground, rock and steel are all physical based types. So a nature that benefits attack and detriments special attack is the best option because you aren't even using your special attack. If you had a mixed attacker, however, would it be good to disadvantage one attack over the other? Most likely no, but do you really want to hurt your defense or speed either? Probably not, so maybe a nature that's neutral would be a good idea. Some of the most important things Fire Red and Leaf Green do is simply implementing changes the series has made over the years. When Red and Blue came out, they were never going to be exactly how they play now, especially considering they are notoriously buggy. Seems like we've come full circle with Scarlet and Violet now. It's crazy to think that's all you need sometimes. Generation 1 just needed to include some of the future improvements that made the series better in general, and that in itself propelled the games even further. They didn't just add the improvements of future games, however, there are also new additions to the games that were in Red and Blue. The biggest addition was the Sevi Islands, a group of 7 general and 2 event islands that contain their own story plot points. As new areas, they also include major locations where you can catch new Pokemon from Generation 2 and Generation 3, and include legendaries via events including Deoxys, Lugia and Ho-Oh. Whilst there were only 9 in total, there was evidence in the beta that there were much more planned, with some having fully programmed map data which implied they were cut probably very late in the development of the games. Majority of these include the post-game content and additional things you're able to do past the original playthrough. As it's based on the previous region, it's very difficult to change that, so the best way to do that is to add new islands that you can explore as post-game content. Some of these include the Trainer Tower, which is similar to the Battle Tower, that provides a more competitive element. Altering Cave, which is one of the more unfortunate additions of Fire Red and Leaf Green. The idea was to be a distribution location for certain Pokemon and it would alter the cave, and therefore the Pokemon found in there. But outside Japan, this never really came to fruition, and it's just a place you can go and find some Zubats nowadays, if you really want to get more in a cave. 5 Island includes the Rocket Warehouse with an additional Team Rocket subplot from just the standard story. 4 Island contains the location of the daycare that allows 2 Pokemon to be placed in it instead of 1, meaning you can't breed Pokemon until 4 Island. An important item added which still to this day is one of the best Pokemon I've ever introduced is the VS Seeker. This allowed you to rematch players you'd previously faced after running a certain amount of steps. This made grinding much easier if you were preparing for the Elite Four, or if you were EV training. The item was that good they actually brought it back in Generation 4. These are some nice additions that do more to the basic core game. Post-game content is very important in Pokemon, especially in the later games, and as Fire Red and Leaf Green are based on games that didn't really have any. They had to add inclusions that made it feel like it was something to do afterwards. The bar would be raised not too long after with the release of Emerald, and that's where the Battle Frontier would come in. But it was a nice and welcome addition for more in the game. Now that doesn't mean it's all nice and rainbows with the remakes. It still gets things wrong, and some of it by its own issue and the others due to the fact more changes hadn't been implemented. The first one for me is that it actually feels like battle-wise is a bit easier compared to the first games. For example, in Red and Blue, Giovanni in the 8th gym battle has a Rhydon, but for some reason they dropped it down to a Rhyhorn in Fire Red and Leaf Green. The Elite Four teams are all 2 levels lower as well, providing less of a challenge. Bear in mind, a lot of the game's issues have now been solved by removing bugs and problems from the previous. One major issue in Red and Blue was the 1 in 256 glitch. This meant even if you used the 100% accuracy move, there was a 1 in 256 chance the move would miss due to programming problems behind the game. Sure, we now have abilities to contend with, and if you pick Squirtle, the rival would have 2 Pokemon with Intimidate, and the AI is also better than the original games, which is important, but I do feel like some of those changes don't make any sense in terms of challenge. We also have the it stopped evolving issue, which still to this day makes no sense to me. A very common thing in Pokemon is to improve on previous Pokemon via new evolutions or forms in future generations. As time has gone on, some Pokemon have fallen behind the curve and need some improvements, so they end up getting new evolutions. Some of these happened as early as Generation 2, so that means some of the Generation 1 Pokemon can evolve into a new form, except in Fire Red and Leaf Green. They just stop evolving. Now, some thought has actually been put into this process. For example, some Pokemon require holding an item while being traded, like the Metal Coat upgrade in King's Rock, and these are all locked behind post-game content, so you can't evolve the likes of Onix, Porygon or Poliwhirl. But Pokemon like Chansey and Golbat, which evolve via liking their trainer, how do you solve that problem? Well, you just don't. You just stop them from evolving. It's very, very strange in my opinion. They clearly planned for this and knew that it would be an issue because they put evolution items behind the post-game, so they knew you would run into this problem, but for these ones in particular, they decided to just stop evolving them until you got the national dex. The best part about this issue is that they changed it in future games. When Heart Gold and Soul Silver came around, they learned from their mistakes and decided just to let the Pokemon evolve. So Pokemon like Mamoswine and Yanmega didn't suffer the same fate as Blissey and Crobat. The game also suffers from not having splits in type and attacks. Pokemon like Hitmonchan would be incredibly useful as they're able to use all the elemental punches with a high attack stat, but all the elemental punches are special based, so it would use its weaker stat instead of its preferred one. Unfortunately for Fire Red and Leaf Green, they came one generation too early to implement this change. Even with these issues, however, the importance in Fire Red and Leaf Green is both the precedent they set and the updates they provided to the original region of the game. Let's get it straight, despite the discord around it sometimes and the Gen 1ers point, the first games are great and the reason that Pokemon had the success that they now have. However, they are outdated and heavily flawed. On the bugs alone, we could do a full-length feature video with some of them being completely game-breaking. Sure, for some of them you have to look for them, but on top of the game-breaking flaws, you have the frustrating elements as well. 1 in 256 is incredibly frustrating, and adds an additional layer of difficulty that's not there by design but error. The AI can be incredibly poor, and Psychic types are literally the most destructive type ever in the original games. They did what they needed to do, but at the same time, not just Pokemon, but gaming in general has moved on from them. The technological advancements that happen every year constantly dwarf the previous. Hence, a game can look great in 2001, but by 2013 it looks massively outdated. Of course, some prefer the original games and that's fine, but when you include the gameplay changes Pokemon has made, in order to make it a much more competitive and fun element alongside these graphical and technological advances, Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green were a necessary lift to the original games. Are they the best port of them? Well, that's up for debate. Generation 1 is pretty lucky as it's had not just one but 2 remakes. Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee are great options, but they're a more simplified version of the game. They don't include things like abilities or traditional battling with wild Pokemon. So that one is a preference, but they provide a lift that was needed for the generation. Not just that, but they have now added an expectation in the market for these remakes. I don't want to bash on Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl too much, but there's a reason it received a much more negative and lukewarm reception compared to the previous remakes. And that's because we have a certain expectation of them. They obviously add the additional gameplay changes that have made the games automatically dramatically better. Between Generation 1 to 3, there was a lot of changes. Between Generation 2 to 4, there was a lot of changes. And between Generation 3 to Generation 6, there was a lot of changes as well. Hence, the original 3 remakes have a lot of positives to them. But it's also the additional game content and adaptations they provide to the games that people love as well. The Sevi Islands were added to Fire Red and Leaf Green as additional post-game content for the remakes. Heart Gold and Soul Silver add the Safari Zone that was originally missed, as well as the Pokemon following feature. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire added new story content and loads of legendaries to catch in place of adding the Battle Frontier from Emerald. Whereas Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl had a bit more of a fateful feel to the originals than a change or an upgrade. If you look at the best and most optimum way to play a generation, you can argue that Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire are better than Emerald, despite missing some of their elements. The same for Fire Red and Leaf Green, and the same for Heart Gold and Soul Silver. Can you argue that Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl are better than Platinum? Probably not. And that's because from the first remakes onwards, there's been a precedent set of escalation in expectation. Every remake has been great or better, and then we got halted a bit with Generation 4. Now, I'm not saying that they are bad, but because of the precedent that was set, and it falls below the said standards, it ends up failing when the rest of them have risen. Because remakes are a big deal. We expect them to be better than the originals, or at least an improvement. And that's because the first remakes made Generation 1 better. They set us on the path we are now on of expectation, and that is Fire Red and Leaf Green's legacy. They improved Generation 1, and they set expectations for us going forward. They are a well appreciated part of Pokemon history, and they have set many standards we now have today. Thanks for watching, everyone. So, time to throw it over to my comments. What are your experiences with Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green? Are they your favourite in the franchise? Are they a little overrated? Maybe you think they're awful. I would love to hear your opinions. Make sure to like and subscribe as it really helps out the channel. And make sure to follow me on Twitter/X, whatever it's called now, for some more Pokemon opinions. Bye guys.